On behalf of the Immigration and Nationality Law Review and our special guest, thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Cesar Garcia Hernandez. He's a professor at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. He publishes crimmigration.com, a blog about the convergence of criminal and immigration law that has been honored as one of the 100 best law blogs by the ABA Journal. In 2014, he received the Derek A. Bell Jr. Award from the Association of American Law Schools Sections on Minority Groups, an honor issued to a junior faculty member who, through activism, mentoring, colleagueship, teaching, and scholarship, has made an extraordinary contribution to legal education, the legal system, or social justice. His book, Crimmigration Law, was published by the American Bar Association in 2015 and has since received much praise. Professor Garcia Hernandez was born and raised in McAllen, Texas. He's a graduate of Brown University and Boston College Law School. We are very honored Professor Garcia Hernandez has accepted our invitation to speak here about immigration imprisonment and its failures. Questions will be answered after the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Garcia Hernandez.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, for that lovely introduction. It's really quite a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to return to Ohio. I spent a few years living and working in Columbus, so there is a certain part of me that feels as if I am, in a way, returning to a community for some time at least. I did consider to be home. And in addition to thanking Gabrielle, I do want to thank the other members of the Immigration and Nationality Law Review who have been so instrumental in making my visit possible. In particular, Josh, who's and whose accompaniment in the last 24 hours or so since I've been in Cincinnati has been flawless and a pleasure to work with. So thank you very much, Josh. It's also a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun being on campus so far this morning and getting to visit with some of the faculty here whose work I've been following for many years, in particular Professor Ho, Professor Williams, whose leadership in the academy has been outstanding for many, many years, and whose motto has been one that I and many others have tried to follow. But in addition to Professor Ho and Professor Williams, I do need to thank also Professor Yolanda Vasquez, whose intellectual contributions to the work that I do and the issues that I'm passionate about have been second to none, and whose own scholarship has really heavily influenced my own, and whose encouragement and support over the last several years has been truly outstanding, and without whom my own work would not be nearly as good as it is, and who I hope you all recognize exactly how lucky you are to be able to have her in your building and in your presence on a daily basis. So with that, let me turn to the focus of my own research, and I want to focus our attention on a defining feature of life in the United States, and that's imprisonment. So while advocates and policymakers and scholars have devoted considerable attention over the last decades to addressing imprisonment, very few have considered the population of people who are locked behind steel doors and surrounded by barbed wire because they have flouted some tenet of immigration control. This is what I call immigration imprisonment. And in particular, in the work that I'm currently doing, I ask whether it is defensible to rely on the government's power to deprive people of their liberty for doing nothing more than violating limitations on mobility. And I argue that it is not. Instead, the United States should abolish immigration prisons. To get there, let me explain. First, let me explain who is inside the immigration prison archipelago that currently exists. Second, let me explain why they're there. And third, I will address why people should not be imprisoned for migration-related activity. I will close by offering an alternative migration ethic that can start the long road toward an immigration law regime that does not involve imprisonment. So let me begin by explaining exactly who experiences immigration imprisonment. This is the nation's population of immigration prisoners. First, as you can see on this slide, on any given day in recent years, there have been roughly 30,000 people who have been detained while the federal government decides if they're going to be allowed to remain in the United States. These are people who are not charged with having committed any crime. They're there because they're thought to have violated a requirement of civil immigration law. For example, staying in the United States after their permission to visit temporarily for vacation has expired. And as you can see from this data, this is a historically unprecedented figure. Over the course of a given year, those 30,000 beds or so that are filled every day will make upwards of 400,000 people who are imprisoned in civil immigration detention by or on behalf of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, which is a unit of the Department of Homeland Security. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of others are imprisoned every year because they are thought to have violated a federal criminal law governing migration activity. The vast majority of such charges are for one of two crimes: illegal entry, which is a federal misdemeanor charge simply for entering the United States without the federal government's permission, or illegal re-entry, which is a federal felony for doing basically the same thing, only doing it after you've been previously deported. In recent years, immigration crime defendants have been the most likely type of federal defendant to face pretrial detention. And as you can see, this is happening at a large scale. In fiscal year 2012, which is what I've graphed up here, the federal government arrested and booked into criminal custody 85,458 people suspected of committing a federal immigration crime. After conviction, migrants are handed over to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. On the last day of that 2012 fiscal year, the BOP imprisoned about 23,000 convicted immigration offenders. Many states are doing their part as well, but I'll leave that for another day. Combined, the federal and state population numbers easily reach more than 500,000 people a year. And while some of immigration imprisonment is labeled civil and some is labeled criminal, the conditions of confinement in secure facilities, they're essentially identical. To house its civil immigration detainees, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency uses a network of 250 or so facilities that are spread throughout the United States, including here in Ohio. And many of these are literally just county jails that purport to be nothing other than penal institutions. ICE essentially just rents bed space from the county sheriff. A facility in South Texas illustrates this overlap quite well. For many years, there's been a private prison operator that's run a facility in the South Texas town of Raymondville, which is the county seat of Willacy County, deep in southeast Texas. Now, back when I represented clients there, it held civil immigration detainees on behalf of ICE. These were folks who were facing possible removal from the United States through the immigration court system. And at the time, it was called the Willacy County Processing Center. Then journalists aired the facility's dirty laundry concerning rampant sexual abuse and other forms of violence. And eventually, DHS moved out its detainees. A month later, the Bureau of Prisons began sending their inmates, almost exclusively people who were convicted of federal immigration crimes to the very same facility. And because these were now convicted criminal offenders, the facility got a name change. It became the Willacy County Correctional Center. Now, here's what it looked like under ICE's Civil Detention Authority. Here's what it looked like under the BOP's criminal confinement powers. Hard to see the difference. Let me turn to why imprisonment has become such a core feature of the way that we regulate migrants and migration. I contend that we've embraced the idea of incarcerating hundreds of thousands of people a year for nonviolent conduct historically thought to be best regulated by civil sanctions, and civil sanctions at most, because of political considerations rooted in fears of the racialized other. For roughly the last 30 years, immigration law has been subsumed under a rhetoric of criminality that frames migrants themselves as the specter of dangerousness. For example, the Cubans who left the island from the port of Mariel in the early 1980s, they were thought to have been the cast-offs from Castro's prisons. They were depicted as such in the popular and the dominant political rhetoric of the period and the popular media of the period, including a particularly emblematic headline in U.S. News and World Report that ran in 1984. Remember, back in 1984, U.S. News and World Report was an actual reputable source of journalism. It wasn't just a law school ranking service. And here's that headline. Castro's crime bomb inside the United States. Forget that this was largely not rooted in fact. This headline blares away what is, we now know, largely a myth that migrants are prone to engage in criminal behavior. More recently, Republican Congressman Steve King of Iowa dismissed efforts to provide a legalization path for unauthorized migrants who were brought to the United States as children, the so-called dreamers. Rather than explain Representative King's concerns to you myself, I'll just have him explain his concern.
The way their parents brought them in, it wasn't their fault. It's true in some cases, but they aren't all valedictorians. They weren't all brought in by their parents. For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there that they weigh 130 pounds and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
Framed as dangerous, it becomes inevitable that migrants will be confined. And eventually that dangerousness frame began to build upon itself. Migrants must be confined because they're dangerous, and they must be dangerous because they're confined. Why else would we put them there? Decades into this problematic experiment, immigration imprisonment has become normal. It has become unremarkable, as it has become, as I've argued in previous work, a seemingly natural feature of a functional immigration law enforcement regime. It should not be so. The history and practice of immigration imprisonment illustrate that it is morally indefensible. Today's immigration prisoners come largely from Mexico and Central America, countries where U.S. military interventions and economic activity has contributed to instability for decades, going back generations. At times, U.S. government officials and private employers have recruited people onto the migrant path under the pretense that these were workers. These were not people who developed habits and who developed ties. President Truman's Commission on Migratory Labor described in this quote the Mexicans of the mid-20th century who came under the auspices of the Bracero program. This was a guest worker initiative. These people were to be ready to go to work when needed, to be gone when not needed. In the half-century since then, migrants have been pushed into a legal marginality that continues to make them vulnerable to exploitation. They're invited into our offices, but only long after we have left. They're present at our meals, but segregated into invisibility behind kitchen doors. They're welcome into our homes, but only as cleaners and as caretakers. And all the while, migrants, whether they have the federal government's permission to be here or not, are pushed towards silence out of fear that complaints will lead to immigration law troubles for them, or their friends, or their relatives. None of this occurs through happenstance. None of this occurs through the magical wave of unstoppable, uncontainable market forces. It happens by design. It happens because policy decisions made it so. If you believe that our laws are a democratic reflection of our political community's values, then it happens because we want it to. Let me explain. In the waning days of the mid-20th century's Bracero program, there were upwards of 200,000 Mexicans who were coming into the United States every year with the federal government's permission to do so. And when that initiative ended in 1964, these people did not stop coming. Their jobs did not all of a sudden evaporate into thin air. And even if Truman's commission wished it were so, their families and their friends here were not suddenly captured by intergalactic space traders and carried offshore. All that changed was their legal permission to come. Instead of adopting a legal regime tailored to economic realities and respectful of human connectedness, Congress created the very illegality that was later used to justify stringent immigration policing tactics, including, most poignantly, imprisonment. In 1965, 1 year after the Bracero program ended, Congress enacted the Immigration Act of 1965 that capped migration from the entire Western Hemisphere at 170,000 people, fewer than the number of Mexicans that were coming the years before then. 11 years later, Congress decided that only 20,000 people could come from any given country. The unsurprising result was that Mexicans, especially, became the picture of immigration lawlessness. The United States has yet to sway from that restrictive approach. When wars ravaged Central America in the 1980s, we ramped up immigration policing along the southwest border, dramatically increased the number of people who were imprisoned, and we denied almost all asylum claims until years of litigation forced a shift. When children who came here during that era reached adolescence and the poor judgment that so often goes along with that period, when that poor judgment led them into criminal activity, we tried to criminalize and deport our way out of productively grappling with the forces that lead to that antisocial behavior. We succumbed to the political fantasy that the geographic distance between, say, San Salvador and Washington, D.C. is greater than it actually is. Unable to do what we were unwilling to try, that is to incorporate these youth into productive activity, Central American nations have suffered from the pernicious edge of our migration policies. Our deportees became their gang members, and now their instability is our migration predicament as children and families head north, head to us, to escape rampant violence. Once more, we've responded with prisons. In addition to the tens of thousands of men who daily fill our immigration prisons, today mothers and children fill entire facilities. Government officials speak of the need to ratchet up confinement, as Justice Department officials told a federal court just last year in a brief that they filed in support and defense of their policy of imprisoning children as young as infants. ICE family residential facilities help DHS to reduce the flow of families who seek to come to the United States unlawfully. That's deterrence. Throughout all this, the immigration prison concretizes migrants' marginalization, and it normalizes their vulnerability. Sexual assaults inside these facilities are endemic. Deaths are not uncommon, and profits are high. 2 decades into this embrace of large-scale immigration and imprisonment practices, we now see the existence of supportive coalitions of third-party actors who have financial motives around which they lobby for increased immigration prisons. The most prominent among these are the private prison corporations that derive hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue from ICE or the Bureau of Prisons or the U.S. Marshal Service for detaining migrants who are awaiting civil removal proceedings or folks who have been charged with or who have been convicted of an immigration offense. The Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, the nation's two largest private prison operators respectively, are both heavily invested in immigration imprisonment. But the same goes for smaller companies. For example, the Management Training Corporation has operated that Willacy County, Texas facility that I mentioned earlier. First, it did so on behalf of ICE. Later, it did so on behalf of the Bureau of Prisons. And there's plenty of money to go around. ICE alone spends about $2 billion every year on its civil immigration detention population. But perhaps more surprising than the role of the private prison corporations, even local governments are economically invested in immigration imprisonment. That Willacy facility, it's actually owned by the county, which contracts with MTC to run the prison. MTC, in turn, contracts with the federal government to house the inmates. And the money just runs in the opposite direction. The federal government pays MTC, and MTC, in turn, pays the county. This makes county officials very interested in keeping prison beds filled. Without prisoners, after all, the county doesn't get paid. And local officials are very well aware of this. As the former mayor of Raymondville said in the quote that's on the screen, if we lose our prisoners, the income comes down. We need everybody to be employed. We need those prisoners. Well, this premonition proved accurate. Eventually, the BOP pulled its inmates out of the Willacy County facility, and within a few weeks, almost everyone lost their jobs. The historical impetus that gave rise to the contemporary immigration imprisonment practice, combined with its actual implementation today, leads me to conclude that immigration imprisonment is a means of domestic social control that builds off of a cross-border history of exploiting Latinas and Latinos in particular. Earlier experiences of violence, of political marginalization, and of economic exploitation appear once more in a familiar, if slightly refracted manner. Instead of official labor recruiters, there are informal pathways to employment. Instead of repressive regimes that govern with United States support, there are the gangs that rule thanks to United States deportation practices. Instead of INS officers who patrol the southwest border to search for migrants, there are about 40,000 DHS personnel whose mission is to identify potential immigration prisoners, whether that's along the border or in the nation's interior. And instead of the fear of being caught and being placed in the immigration prison pipeline, well, there's still the fear of being caught and being placed in the immigration prison pipeline. A policing structure authorized by law that turns on intersecting racial and class markers of undesirability is brought into its core. But it's not unique in United States history. Our nation's most sordid embrace of widespread commodification of people as a means of social control is, of course, slavery. That institution, its demise, and its aftermath have much to teach us. Built on an explicitly racist ideology that nonetheless was sufficiently flexible to be deployed through gendered violence, slavery hinged on converting black bodies into economically quantifiable values and little more. Black men were valued for their productive abilities, while black women were valued for their productive and reproductive capacities. Beneficiaries of the institution of slavery, little else mattered. Constructed by law as outsiders to the polity, physical and psychological violence were wielded to marginalize enslaved Africans and native-born blacks into a position of maximum vulnerability. Despite its extreme violence, resistance was not unusual. Abolitionists did not simply decry slavery's contours. They did not simply ask for an end to beatings, to rapes, or to forced separations of families without due process. They demanded a wholesale rejection of slavery's view of humans racialized as black. They demanded that slaves be treated as humans with an innate dignity that could not justifiably be stripped. Not just that it could be stripped with due process. So too, immigration imprisonment hinges on a cheapened view of humans that no amount of legal reform can fix. It's a form of social control built on race-based commodification of human life that in turn reproduces the very racial subordination from which it springs. Like slavery, immigration imprisonment cannot be fixed, so it should instead be abolished. But cutting the barbed wire that currently confines so many migrants will not alter the morally skewed view of migrants as people who can rightfully be exploited. Just as the Civil War's end did not bring white supremacy's demise, the abolition of immigration prisons will not alone hearken a reevaluation of migrants' inherent dignity. To ensure that one form of state violence does not simply replace another, it's necessary to craft an alternative moral ethic of migrants and of migration that stands at odds with the rhetoric of migrant criminality that led to this large-scale immigration imprisonment. I take a step in that direction by offering a two-part alternative migration ethic. First, it's imperative that we trace a line through the shadows of history to reconceive of the United States as an active participant in migratory patterns. The history of United States relations with the countries from which most immigration prisoners come, it's long, it's bloody, and it's profitable. It's also entrenched in contemporary economic networks, and it's embodied in people like me with binational, bicultural, bilingual existences. And for all that can be said of this migration pattern, here's what cannot be said: that it is accidental. Mexicans and Central Americans are in the United States and in our immigration prisons because of policy choices made there and made here. Instead of an ahistorical myth of migration that treats migrants as atomized actors, we must acknowledge that migration is persistent and that it is patterned. And then we must move away from a legal binary that treats those who came earlier in time as morally superior. That those who happen to be born in the United States and are therefore United States citizens stand on no greater moral plane than those who happen to have been born elsewhere and who came here as a result of those choices. As such, I contend that we ought to place today's arrivals on the same moral ground as the descendants of yesterday's arrivals. Second, I propose an alternative moral vision of migrants that is true to human nature. We're all fallible. We're all imperfect. And though I imagine there would be little debate about that, it's equally clear to me that immigration law does not reflect this reality. On the contrary, it sorts based on a wide range of markers of undesirability. Not enough family, not enough money, too much involvement with the criminal justice system, as if solitude and poverty and criminality did not define the American condition in the 21st century. Instead of a moral frame that pretends that we're more wholesome than we are, that we're more wholesome than we ever have been, I would like to see a moral framing of migrants that holds them to the same standards as we hold United States citizens. Create accountability, but not imprison solely based on the accident of birth. That, I'll stop. If you're interested in more about these topics, visit my blog, criminality.com. happy to take any questions. Yes.
Okay, thank you for coming here. It's an amazing talk. And my first question is whether the talk is going to be available when we're done here, which is a great talk. Mike?
I will have to defer to the organizers
Yeah, so
about
we
that.
always so Mike up there takes it, we post it on the UC ILR website, so it'll be available on there.
I'm from the Cincinnati Interfaith Worker Center, and I'd like that translated for our members and made available to them as soon as possible.
This is really wonderful comment. My question is whether for you there's any relationship between Ronald Reagan's effort to end collective bargaining rights for migrant workers in California as governor and what happened in the changes to the immigration system in the 1980s, making employment of immigrants a crime. And maybe there's no connection. For me, there is one, and I just wanted to see if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for me, I think that's emblematic of a great push toward greater vulnerability of migrants and not just of migrants, but of people generally. It's one in which jobs become less of a security blanket, and when immigration status is so often inextricably linked to employment. In many contexts, people come here to the United States explicitly because of some employment offer that they have. Then the possibility of losing that means that they're always vulnerable. And so for me, the connection is it's a way of making it easier to exploit that labor.
One of the arguments I always hear is that, oh, these immigrants are coming over here, they're not paying taxes, they're sucking our welfare system drive. What from your expertise, your research, would you say would be the balance of tax revenue contribution versus social welfare utilization? And how does that play a role in why would we want to criminalize immigration itself? Is it more than just the movement, if you will, or is there some other social or economic aspects that we need to look at?
We could think about that in a very holistic, perspective that spans the history of U.S. involvement, in particular in Latin America and in parts of Asia, and why that brings people to the United States. Or we can say at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because humans are humans, and there's something more valuable to humans. They contribute something that is apart from their labor, right? And so I think the risk of that, going down the road of saying, well, actually immigrants contribute lots of money in sales tax and personal income tax and blah, 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 that boils us down to our economic productivity. And while I like to think of myself as an economically productive human being, I don't like to think of my identity as being tied up with my economic productivity. And I don't like to think of my worth and my ability and my ability to participate in our democratic governance as being hinging on me being productive, an economically productive member of this community.
Do you see any role for immigration law at all, limiting the number of people coming to the United States, and if so, for a civil removal system that doesn't include prisons being acceptable to you?
Yeah, maybe. Although so far we are such a long distance away from that that I feel like engaging in this conversation about whether confinement is a defensible means of enforcing immigration law occupies my time, right? Because the reality is that right now there are babies, there are infants who are behind barbed wires in prisons in the middle of nowhere. And so we have a long way to go before we get to the point of talking about whether immigration law as a whole ought to go and whether there's some defensible way of enforcing an immigration law regime writ large.
I heard you briefly mention deterrence as a justification for the immigration prison system. So I guess, is there any evidence one way or the other how much that actually works as a deterrence to illegal immigration? And I know you mentioned civil penalties at the beginning being a replacement, but I guess at the end I didn't, and maybe I just missed it, I didn't hear you specifically say what, absent prisons, what should the punishment be? Or should there be punishment at all? And if there is a deterrent effect of prisons, will getting rid of them just open the borders, essentially? People will feel no motivation to not come here.
The question about whether prisons of any kind deter is one that's been written about a lot, and specifically in the context of immigration. The empirical data suggests that there's not much of a deterrent effect. I don't really think that matters. I think we have to think about. So empirically, it's not supported. Maybe it is for like 2 months, for a very short period of time, as people sort of plan a little bit more strategically. Prepare a little bit more. They hire somebody, for example, that's going to raise their likelihood of getting across. So yeah, it creates a market in transportation across the border, in illicit transportation. I think that ultimately that's less important of a concern than the human impact, and that's what that I think gets to your question about alternative punishments. Well, I don't think that we should be punished. I think we should only punish when there's a measurable harm, and I don't think that there is much of a measurable harm. Certainly not by being in the country without the federal government's permission. Certainly not one that merits what is the second most severe form of state-inflicted violence that's permissible in most Western democracies. Right? The only thing that's worse is actually killing people, which we do and most places don't. But aside from that, imprisonment is as violent as it gets. And for what? For coming here without the federal government's permission? I don't think that is at all a proportionate response.
Looking at the statistics that you had first put up about approximately 30,000 individuals a day and how that corresponds to about 400,000 over the course of a year, the Obama administration has been deporting approximately 400,000 people every year since, I believe they hit that capacity around 2011, 2012. I'm a practitioner of immigration law and do a lot of removal defense work, and what I've seen, at least in our area, is I think we've kind of maxed out the capacity of the system with the current amount of people who can be incarcerated, but there are all sorts of new technologies such as electronic monitoring of individuals who are in removal proceedings, which has become very popular in this area. And if one, say, misses a scheduled period in which they have to go to the Columbus ICE office, they're subject to being picked up as fugitives and put into the prison. And I have seen, I would say, probably an increase in our area, fourfold of ICE agents who deal strictly with fugitives, and all based upon this additional type of detention, which is the electronic. I don't know if that's something that we're only seeing here, or are you seeing it on a nationwide level?
Yeah, certainly. So the question about whether we've maxed out capacity is an interesting one because that's just a question of money. How much money Congress wants to spend. If we want to spend $3 billion on this, we could. As hopefully was clear, I think about doing that. But the issue of alternatives to detention, in particular these sophisticated technologies like ankle bracelets, is a fascinating one because that's often the substitute that's offered by advocates, including advocates who are very sympathetic toward migrants. They say, well, let people out of prison. Just, if you're worried about them endangering the community or not showing up, well, slap a bracelet on them, right? I think that's highly problematic. I think it's highly problematic in large part for the reason that you alluded to, which is it's a great way to lead people back into prison. We know this from the criminal justice realm, where one of the biggest reasons that people are now in prison is because they were released previously on some supervision order that for one reason or another they violated, and now they're back inside jail or prison. In the immigration context, I think the implication and the risk is that once you let somebody out on an ankle bracelet or some other alternative to detention, first, what we've seen ICE do is they're not taking people who would have in the past been imprisoned and letting them out with an ankle bracelet. They're taking people who in the past would have been let out without any conditions, without any reporting requirements, and strapping an ankle bracelet on them, right? So it's actually expanding the ICE's surveillance ability, not moving people from being surveilled inside of a facility to being surveilled outside of a facility. The other risk is once you violate it, then we can look at you like you are a moral scofflaw, right? Like you screwed up. We gave you a chance. We let you out of prison. We could have kept you in there, but we're nice, and so we let you out, and this is what you did. You just messed up. You couldn't show up in Columbus? I mean, that's not hard. Get on the bus, right? And that's the perspective, and so then it's easier to justify leading people back into incarceration.
Thank you. In the, the draft article, you talked about ICE officials and judges don't have discretion to decline detention, and made the statement that that congressional mandate has survived a constitutional challenge, but there's no cite given, and I'd like to know what case or cases actually upheld that.
What was the point that I made?
Neither ICE officials nor immigration judges have discretion to decline detention or allow release after the fact. And then you make the statement, this congressional mandate survived a constitutional challenge.
Oh, I think that's referring to Section 236C of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And the cases that are relevant to detention are Zidvitas versus Davis and Demore versus Kim. Off the top of my head, what the citations are. Zidvitas is Zadyvdas, and Demore versus Kim.
Any other questions?
I guess I actually don't need this, but thank you. So I guess this is the annoying comment and question. Brennan was saying earlier, I've been teaching this Asian American history and law class, and we've talked a lot about immigration, of course, and the more and more I am convinced that it's really, that immigration history is essentially labor history. Not to be kind of like overly materialist about it or anything, but I can't deal with this. It's just like, makes this, no. So I guess it's a question about race, and how race informs immigration policy. I mean, I know that you talk about it, and I really appreciate your connection to the institution of slavery. But it seems like when you look at immigration patterns, particularly from Well, actually, in American history, so much of it is tied to labor and the exploitation of resources and colonialism and imperialism, and and so it's all tied also to a capitalistic ideology. And so, as you were saying earlier, that you don't like to think of yourself as just sort of being an economic producer. That is precisely how capitalism kind of identifies all of us. So, I guess the question is like, how do you respond to that kind of bigger, I don't know, problem, question?
Well, I think what I said was not that I'm not viewed in that way. It's that I don't want to view myself in that way. I don't think we ought to be viewing people in that way. I think that as a normative question that's problematic. As an actual matter, I think that you're right, that we are largely distilled into down to our economic capacities. And so I agree with you that the history of immigration is in large part a history of labor relations. It's a history in which immigrants were lured to the United States, even in the generations before the existence of the United States, in large part because of their need for the need for the colonial enterprises to develop and to maintain a supply of laborers. And sometimes it was independent laborers, sometimes it was servile labor, and to extract resources from the work that was happening here, whether that was working with the natural resources or otherwise. Yeah. So I agree with you that story is that labor is a central part of the story. But if we know anything about the history of the United States, is that labor and race are inextricably intertwined, and that's why we developed chattel slavery, right? Very much a racialized form of economic exploitation of human beings. And I'm trying to draw some parallels between what's happening, how the moral core of slavery and the moral core of immigration imprisonment, not because I think that there's an analogy to be made between the institutions and the effect on people. I mean, immigration prison, it's not slavery, it's not. But the moral foundation and the rottenness of the moral foundation, I think, is what I'm trying to learn from.
Do you know if there's any comparative study of immigration policies or migration policies relating to labor, comparing sort of policies affecting Latinos and Latinas and Asians? Because it seems like there's a lot, obviously with Asian labor, that resulted in exclusion that was significantly more successful than what we're trying to do now. But
Canal Parker's book, I can't remember off the top of my head, is one that isn't focused on any particular racial group, but that does mention both Asians and Latinos, and talks about the way in which citizenship has sort of been a fluid concept since before the nation's founding. Kunal Parker, Kunal Parker. He's at Miami.
I'm trying to. Is there any country in the world that you think has an acceptable immigration system? The version of that capitalism. There seems to be a suggestion that somehow open borders ought to be the norm. And I guess I'm just puzzled because I'm not sure I know of any country in the world that agrees with that. And in fact, what we're presently seeing occurring in Europe, there's a great risk that the international law that we have has established the protection for political refugees may well become unglued as a result of the current crisis that we're having.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, is there any country that has an acceptable immigration system? No, but that's not a reason to stop, right? That's not a reason not to make the critique that I think needs to be. I would hope that we never live in a world in which having fanciful thoughts, nothing will ever get better. In terms of Europe, Europe has never been, the EU has never been, the borders were pushed out, right? And they were pushed out to the periphery where Europe meets people who are not white. And so the threat to European cooperation is one that is facing a big threat now because of the fear of the people of color coming into Europe in a way that is neither surprising nor unpredictable, but that is frightening to large segments of that population. But at its root, always been a regime, a political community that hinges on border control. For a long time they relied on the Mediterranean and did so successfully.
I think that would be the last question. We have probably have a class coming in at 1:30. We have one more question, and we. All right.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your questions.